At first, nothing seems unusual about the quiet hallway. The fluorescent lights hum softly as they always do during the night shift. A correctional female officer walks past rows of identical metal doors, checking names against a clipboard with mechanical precision. When she reaches one particular cell, she slows down. The bed inside looks untouched, as if no one slept there at all. The locker is closed. The sink is dry. A woman who is supposed to be there is not. By the time alarms begin to sound, the moment has already passed. This is the case of Sarah Pender, a woman whose story challenges how we think about guilt, intelligence, and responsibility. It is a case that forces uncomfortable questions about whether violence always looks violent and whether planning can be just as deadly as pulling a trigger. For years, her role was debated, minimized, and misunderstood. And long after a jury believed the story was finished, it took an unexpected turn that brought everything back into question. Before this case became about courtrooms and convictions, it was about two men living ordinary lives. Jonathan Schreier and Thomas Hunter were not strangers to risk, but they were also not expecting betrayal from within their own circle. Both men were involved in low-level drug dealing, a reality that shaped their daily routines and social relationships. They spent time with friends, trusted people they believed they understood, and moved through their lives without imagining how quickly that trust could become a liability. They were not faceless names in a police report. They were sons, friends, and people with futures that abruptly ended in a way no one around them anticipated. In the months before their deaths, money, loyalty, and personal relationships quietly became entangled in ways that would later prove fatal. In Indianapolis during the late 1990s, Sarah Pender lived a life that appeared on the surface controlled and unremarkable. She was intelligent, well-spoken, and pursuing an engineering degree, a field that demanded discipline and structure. To people who knew her casually, she did not fit the stereotype of someone connected to violent crime. She shared living arrangements with her boyfriend, William "Bill" Pennington, a man whose criminal history stood in sharp contrast to her academic ambitions. Their relationship blended romance, financial dependency, and power in subtle ways that few outsiders questioned. Money passed hands, trust was assumed. Tensions existed, but none seemed extraordinary enough to trigger alarm. At the time, nothing in their daily lives suggested they were approaching an irreversible point. On November 29, 2000, that sense of normalcy collapsed. Jonathan Schreier and Thomas Hunter were lured to Pender and Pennington's apartment under the pretense of a drug transaction. What happened next was not immediately clear, even to investigators. Gunshots were fired inside the apartment. Both men were killed at close range. Their bodies were later wrapped, transported, and dumped in a rural area of Wisconsin. The crime itself did not unfold in a clean or obvious sequence. Accounts differed, timelines conflicted, critical details were missing or deliberately obscured. In the immediate aftermath, confusion defined everything that followed. When police began investigating the murders, their attention initially focused on the most visible suspect. William Pennington had a criminal record, access to weapons, and a temperament that aligned more closely with expectations of violence. Investigators believed they understood the case early on, and that belief shaped the direction of the investigation. Sarah Pender, by contrast, appeared calm, cooperative, and detached. She did not match the profile officers were conditioned to look for. Key details were overlooked because they did not fit the narrative investigators were constructing. Witness statements that hinted at planning rather than impulsive violence were not immediately prioritized. At this stage, the investigation moved forward with confidence that later proved premature. As the case developed, a different picture began to emerge. Evidence suggested that the murders were not spontaneous acts fueled by emotion, but calculated decisions motivated by money and control. Investigators described conversations in which she discussed eliminating Schreier and Hunter as obstacles. This information reframed her role entirely. Rather than a passive bystander, prosecutors began to view her as the architect of the crime. The case had stalled not because there was no evidence, but because it took investigators time to recognize the significance of her influence. What made this case particularly unsettling was the absence of overt aggression from Sarah Pender. Her involvement was defined not by physical violence, but by persuasion, planning, and control. Prosecutors argued that she leveraged her intelligence and emotional influence over Pennington to orchestrate the murders. She identified the problem, outlined the solution, and allowed someone else to carry it out. The escalation happened gradually through conversations rather than confrontations. No dramatic threats were reported. Instead, the case revealed how authority can be exercised quietly through trust and dependency rather than fear. It forced jurors to confront whether directing violence is fundamentally different from committing it. In 2002, Sarah Pender was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. The prosecution presented evidence that she had planned the killings and instructed Pennington to carry them out. Witness testimony, financial records, and prior statements were used to establish motive and intent. The defense argued that she was being unfairly portrayed as a mastermind based on circumstantial evidence. They emphasized the lack of physical involvement in the killings themselves. After deliberation, the jury found her guilty. She was sentenced to 110 years in prison, a decision that reflected the court's belief that planning and orchestration carried equal moral weight. For the families of Jonathan Schreier and Thomas Hunter, the verdict provided a measure of accountability, but not closure. Their loss remained permanent, regardless of sentencing. Sarah Pender was transferred to the Rockville Correctional Facility, where she became known as a compliant and intelligent inmate. She worked in the prison library and was perceived as low risk. That perception would later prove consequential. Years passed, and public attention faded. The case appeared settled, its outcome final. Then, in 2008, everything changed. That year, Sarah Pender escaped from prison with the help of a former prison employee. The escape was carefully planned and executed without immediate detection. It shocked the public and reignited debate about who she really was. Her freedom lasted several months before she was captured in Chicago. The empty prison cell from the cold open was no longer symbolic, it was real. Her escape raised unsettling questions about underestimation, trust, and systemic vulnerability. It forced society to reconsider whether danger is always loud, or whether it can also be methodical and unseen. And even now, the case leaves one final question unresolved. Is responsibility defined by action alone, or by the decisions that make violence inevitable? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story impacted you, please like and subscribe. Turn on notifications. We're covering another shocking case next week.